Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Frozen Faces of Bitter Creek. The winter of 1987 arrived early in Bitter Creek, Manitoba, a town so small that everyone knew when someone bought a new pair of boots. Population? 847. That number would soon change. Darren Hoffmeyer had lived in Bitter Creek his entire 34 years. He worked at the grain elevator, drank at Murphy's Tavern every Friday, and never missed Sunday dinner at his mother's house on Elm Street. His routine was as predictable as the prairie wind, which is why people noticed immediately when he didn't show up for work on Monday, November 16th. His supervisor, Malcolm Pettigrew, drove out to Darren's farmhouse around noon. The property sat 3 miles outside town, surrounded by flat, endless fields that stretched to the horizon. Malcolm found Darren's truck in the driveway, engine cold, windows covered in frost. The front door was unlocked, swinging slightly in the bitter wind. Malcolm stepped inside and immediately felt something wrong. The house was colder inside than outside, impossibly so. His breath formed thick clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. He called out for Darren, his voice swallowed by an oppressive silence. He found Darren in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee frozen solid in his hand. But it was Darren's face that made Malcolm stumble backward, his breakfast rising in his throat. Darren's expression was twisted into something that couldn't be natural, couldn't be human. His mouth was open in a scream, but his eyes were wide with what looked like ecstasy. Terror and joy frozen together in an impossible expression that the human face wasn't designed to make. Malcolm ran. He drove straight to the RCMP detachment where Constable Patricia Dunmore took his statement. She thought he was drunk or suffering from exposure until she saw his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold the pen to sign his statement. Patricia drove out to the Hoffmeyer place with her partner, Constable Raymond Bouchard. They found exactly what Malcolm had described, but they also found something he'd missed in his panic. Frost patterns on the windows, but not normal frost. These patterns formed faces, dozens of them, all with that same impossible expression of terror and rapture combined. They called for backup. By nightfall, the RCMP had cordoned off the property. Dr. Leonard Strauss, the town's only physician, examined Darren's body in situ. He'd been a coroner in Vancouver before retiring to Bitter Creek, had seen every kind of death the human body could experience. This was different. His face muscles tore themselves apart, Dr. Strauss explained to Patricia, his voice barely above a whisper. The expression he's making, it required his facial muscles to contract in opposing directions simultaneously. The pain would have been excruciating. But look at his eyes. The capillaries burst from dilation, not stress. He was experiencing intense pleasure when he died. They transported Darren's body to the funeral home, the only facility in town with cold storage. That night, 3 more people died. The Vanderhook sisters, Astrid and Helene, who ran the town's only bakery, and Timothy Marchand, the high school janitor. All found in their homes. All with the same impossible expression frozen on their faces. All in rooms that were impossibly cold. The town panicked. People packed what they could and tried to leave. But a blizzard descended on Bitter Creek that night, the worst anyone could remember. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The temperature dropped to -40, then -50. The highways became impassable. Bitter Creek was cut off from the world. More people died that night, then more the next day. The pattern became clear. It happened to people who were alone. The thing, whatever it was, came for people in isolation. Families huddled together in the community center, the church, anywhere with other people. But supplies were running low. The power kept flickering, and the cold was seeping in through every crack and crevice. Patricia Dunmore worked around the clock, trying to make sense of it. She found a connection nobody had noticed. Every victim had lived in Bitter Creek their entire lives. Every single one. People who'd moved to town, even those who'd been there for decades, weren't affected. It only wanted the ones who belonged to this place. On the fourth night, Patricia was alone in the RCMP detachment, going through old records. She'd sent Raymond home hours ago, told him to be with his family. The building was quiet, except for the howling wind outside. She found something in the archives, a newspaper clipping from 1923. The article described the founding of Bitter Creek. The land had been purchased from a Cree community, but the transaction was disputed. The Cree elders had warned the settlers that this land was forbidden, that something lived in the deep cold here, something that demanded solitude to feed. The settlers had laughed and built their town anyway. Patricia heard the temperature alarm go off. The detachment was dropping below freezing, though the heat was running full blast. She saw her breath crystallize in the air, falling like snow. The lights flickered, and in the darkness between pulses she saw frost creeping across the windows, forming faces, getting closer. She ran for the door, but her muscles were already stiffening from the cold. She could feel something pressing against her mind, promising her wonders beyond imagination if she would just stop running, just be still, just be alone with it. The sensation was seductive, horrifying, irresistible. Her hand touched the doorknob, and she heard voices outside. Raymond had come back, brought a group of people worried about her. The moment she heard them, felt their presence nearby, the cold retreated. The thing that lived in Bitter Creek's winter couldn't touch anyone who wasn't truly alone. The blizzard broke on the 7th day. By then, 43 people were dead, their bodies stored in the hockey arena, the only place cold enough to preserve them. The survivors evacuated. Most never came back. The town still exists, technically. A few stubborn souls returned after the thaw, refusing to abandon their homes. But Bitter Creek is dying. The population dropped to just over 200. And every winter they huddle together, terrified of being caught alone when the temperature drops and the frost begins to form those impossible, beautiful, terrible faces on their windows. Story 2. The Singing Cave of Port Renwick. Port Renwick, Nova Scotia, was a fishing village clinging to the Atlantic coast like a barnacle to a ship's hull. In the summer of 1993, something crawled out of the caves beneath the cliffs, and the screaming started. Nora Calloway was 16 that summer, working at her father's bait shop and dreaming of anywhere else. Port Renwick had 412 residents, one grocery store, and no future as far as Nora could see. She spent her evenings on the cliffs above the ocean, watching the sunset and planning her escape. The caves had always been there, carved into the cliff face by millennia of waves. Local kids dared each other to explore them, though nobody went far. The caves flooded at high tide, and the darkness inside was absolute. Old stories said the caves went down for miles, connecting to underground rivers that flowed beneath the entire province. Nora first heard the singing on July 14th. She was sitting on her usual spot on the cliffs, feet dangling over the edge, when a sound drifted up from below. At first, she thought it was the wind in the caves, that hollow moaning sound the ocean makes when it breathes through stone. But this was different. This was a melody. The song had no words, just pure notes that seemed to bypass her ears and vibrate directly in her chest. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard, and she found herself climbing down toward the cave entrance before she realized what she was doing. She stopped herself at the last moment, suddenly terrified for reasons she couldn't articulate. She told her best friend, Marcus Thibodeau, about it the next day. Marcus laughed it off, said it was probably just acoustics and imagination. But that night, he heard it too. He was walking home from the community center when the singing started, floating up from the drainage grate by the old cannery. He stood there for 20 minutes, transfixed, until his mother came looking for him. More people heard it over the following week, always in the evening, always near openings to the cave system. The singing would start soft and distant, then grow louder, more insistent. Some people said it sounded like a woman. Others swore it was a child. A few claimed it was multiple voices in perfect harmony. Everyone agreed on one thing. Once you heard it, you couldn't stop thinking about it. Gilbert Rousseau was the first to disappear. He was a lobster fisherman, 58 years old, with hands like leather and a laugh that could be heard across the harbor. His wife, Estelle, reported him missing when he didn't come home on July 23rd. His boat was found anchored near the cliffs, engine still running, but Gilbert was gone. The RCMP searched the waters, assuming he'd fallen overboard. They didn't find a body. What they did find, when they checked his boat's log, was strange. Gilbert had written page after page of musical notation in the margins, staff lines drawn in shaky pencil, notes scattered across them in no pattern that made sense. The last entry simply read, "I understand now. It's calling me home." 2 days later, Martha Devereaux disappeared. Then Kyle Sanderson. Then the Merchant twins, Devon and Cassidy. All of them last seen near the cliffs. All of them had mentioned hearing the singing to someone before they vanished. The pattern was clear and terrifying. The town council called an emergency meeting. They decided to seal the cave entrances with concrete, block whatever was making that sound. A construction crew came in from Halifax. They worked for 2 days, pouring concrete into the main cave mouth and 3 smaller openings nearby. The singing stopped. For 48 hours, Port Renwick was silent except for the normal sounds of ocean and wind. People began to relax. Then Marcus's little sister, 8-year-old Sophie Thibodeau, began to hum. Just quietly at first, while doing her homework. Her mother thought nothing of it until she realized Sophie was humming the same melody over and over, that eerie tune from the caves. Sophie hummed for 3 days straight. She hummed in her sleep. She hummed while eating. When her parents tried to stop her, she would start crying, huge, racking sobs, until they let her hum again. Other children in town began doing the same thing. 7 kids, all under 12, all humming that impossible melody. Dr. Francis Montrose, the local physician, examined the children. He found nothing physically wrong, but he noticed something disturbing. When the children hummed, their vocal cords didn't move the way they should. The sound was coming from deeper, resonating in their chest cavities in a way that shouldn't be anatomically possible. On August 3rd, the children walked to the cliffs, all 7 of them, in the middle of the night, still in their pajamas. They moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes open but unseeing. Sophie's mother woke up and found her daughter's bed empty. She ran outside and saw a line of children walking down Main Street toward the ocean. The whole town mobilized. Parents grabbed their children, held them tight, but the kids fought back, with inhuman strength. Little Sophie broke her mother's nose, still humming that melody through the blood and tears. The children were dragging adults toward the cliffs, and the singing was starting again, louder than ever, pouring out of every crack in the ground, every drainage pipe, every foundation. The concrete barriers had done nothing. Whatever was down there was finding new ways up. Nora Calloway realized something the adults had missed. The children weren't being controlled from outside. Something had gotten inside them when they heard the singing. She remembered that first night, how close she'd come to climbing down into the caves, how the sound had seemed to bypass her ears entirely. She gathered Marcus and a few other teenagers who'd resisted the call. They had a theory. The adults were trying to fight the singing, trying to block it out. But you couldn't fight it. You had to let it in, really listen to it, and then choose to reject it. It sounded insane. It was their only option. Nora sat on the cliff edge, right above the sealed cave mouth, and opened herself completely to the singing. It flooded through her like ice water, and suddenly she could understand it. The song wasn't random. It was telling a story. Something ancient had been sleeping in those caves for thousands of years. Human settlement had disturbed it, but it was too weak to do more than call out. It needed people to come to it, to give themselves willingly, so it could feed and grow strong enough to emerge. The more people it took, the stronger its call became. That's why it had started with adults and moved to children. Children's minds were easier to influence. If it took the children, it would have enough strength to take everyone. Nora understood all of this in an instant, and she understood something else. She could sing back. The creature's song had structure, had rules. She could learn them. She could use them. She opened her mouth and began to sing. Her voice cracked at first, uncertain, but Marcus joined her. Then the other teenagers. They sang a different melody, one that wove through the creature's call and disrupted it. They didn't know how they knew the notes. They just did, instinctively, the way you know how to breathe. The children stopped struggling. One by one, they blinked, confused, and their parents pulled them back from the cliff edge. The singing from below grew frantic, discordant, and then it began to fade. Whatever was down there was retreating, back into the deep caves, back into its ancient sleep. But before it faded completely, Nora heard one last phrase, clear as crystal in her mind. "I'll be here. I'll always be here. And someday you'll forget to sing back." Port Renwick hired geologists after that, sealed every opening to the cave system they could find. The town installed a warning siren, tested every Friday at noon. They taught every child the counter song, made it part of the school curriculum. Most people moved away, anyway. The population dropped to barely 100. Nora left for university that fall, never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, in her apartment in Montreal, she wakes up humming. And she has to sing the counter melody until the sun comes up, terrified of what might hear her if she stops. Story 3. The Disappearing Highway of Thornwood. Highway 517 through Thornwood, Ontario, was 63 kilometers of cracked asphalt cutting through dense forest. In the fall of 1998, people started driving onto it and never coming out the other side. Garrett McDonald was a long-haul trucker who knew every highway in Ontario, like the veins on the back of his hand. He'd driven through Thornwood 100 times, usually around midnight when traffic was light and he could make good time. The town itself was barely a town. A gas station, a diner, a motel, and maybe 40 houses scattered along the highway. On October 9th, Garrett entered Highway 517 from the south. His dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. He had a delivery in Sudbury by morning, and he was making good time. The highway was empty, just him and the yellow lines and the trees pressing in on both sides. He drove for 20 minutes, then 30, then an hour. The highway should have taken 15 minutes to traverse, end to end. But he kept driving, and the road just kept going. The trees looked the same. The yellow lines looked the same. His odometer said he'd traveled 90 kilometers, but he was still on Highway 517, still surrounded by forest. His CB radio crackled. He heard voices, distant and distorted. "Where are we? How long have you been driving? I passed the same tree. I know I passed the same tree." other drivers, other people trapped on this impossible road. Garrett tried to turn around, but every time he found a place wide enough, the road behind him looked different than the road ahead. More curves, more trees, like the highway was rearranging itself when he wasn't looking. His fuel gauge was dropping fast. Panic set in. He drove until dawn, and when the sun came up, he saw something that stopped his heart. On the side of the road, partially hidden by underbrush, was a truck. His truck. Same company logo, same license plate. He pulled over, got out on shaking legs, and walked toward it. The truck was old, rusted, like it had been sitting there for years. But Garrett had been driving it an hour ago. He heard an engine behind him and spun around. His truck was still there, where he'd parked it. But now there were two of them. He was looking at his future and his past simultaneously, and the highway was eating time itself. Garrett started running. He crashed into the forest, branches tearing at his face, and he ran until his lungs burned. He heard the highway behind him, the sound of eternal traffic, cars that had been driving forever and would never stop. He ran until he couldn't hear it anymore, until he collapsed in a clearing miles from any road. A hunting party found him 2 days later, half dead from exposure and dehydration. He told them about the highway, about the impossible loop, about seeing his own truck rusting by the roadside. They thought he'd had some kind of breakdown until they checked the news. 7 people had been reported missing on Highway 517 in the past month. All of them had entered the highway. None of them had exited. The OPP had investigated but found nothing unusual. Cars drove through Thornwood every day without incident. But the missing people's families insisted. Their loved ones had called them, terrified, saying the highway wouldn't end. Detective Sarah Kinsley took over the investigation. She was thorough, logical, and completely unprepared for what she found. She drove Highway 517 herself, in broad daylight, with backup following. She made it through fine. So did her backup. They tried it at night, still fine. They couldn't replicate the phenomenon. But the disappearances continued. 3 more people in November, 5 in December. All of them vanished on Highway 517. All of them between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. All of them traveling alone. Sarah interviewed Garrett extensively. His story never changed, never wavered. He'd been on that highway for 8 hours, drove over 400 kilometers according to his odometer, but never left a 63-kilometer stretch of road. Time and space had folded in on themselves. She started researching the highway's history. Highway 517 was built in 1962, cut through virgin forest that had never been logged or settled. The construction crew had experienced problems from the start. Equipment malfunctioned. Workers reported feeling watched. 3 men died in accidents that the official reports called unexplainable. One of the dead men had been driving a bulldozer. He'd suddenly accelerated, crashing through a guardrail and into the forest. When they found him, his hands were frozen to the controls, and his eyes were wide open. The autopsy showed he'd been dead for at least an hour before the crash, but witnesses swore they'd seen him driving. Sarah found the foreman's personal journal in an archive in Thunder Bay. The last entry, dated September 14, 1962, read, "The forest doesn't want this road. I see the same trees every day, no matter how much we cut. The men say we're going in circles. But the surveyor's equipment says we're making progress. Something is wrong with this place. Wrong with the space itself." The highway opened in October 1962. There were no incidents at first. The disappearances started in 1971, just 1 or 2 a year. Always isolated travelers. Always at night. Always written off as accidents, people driving into the forest or falling asleep at the wheel. The pattern had been there for decades, and nobody had noticed. Sarah convinced her superiors to close Highway 517. They set up checkpoints, redirected traffic. For 3 months, nobody drove that stretch of road. The disappearances stopped. The town of Thornwood, dependent on highway traffic, began to die. Businesses closed. People moved away. In March, the pressure became too much. The highway reopened with new signage. Do not drive this highway alone between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. It seemed to work. People traveled in pairs, convoys. The disappearances stopped. Until August 14th, when Emily and Jacob Sorensen, a couple from Toronto, drove onto Highway 517 at 11:30 p.m. They were together. They should have been safe. Their last phone call to Emily's sister came at 11:52 p.m. Emily was crying. "We can't find the end. Jacob is driving, but the road just keeps going. We're together, but I feel so alone. It's like the highway is between us now. It's separating us somehow. Jacob is getting farther away even though he's right here. I can't." The call cut off. They were never seen again. Sarah drove Highway 517 one last time in September. She had to know. She entered at 11:45 p.m., alone, breaking every protocol. The highway stretched ahead of her, normal, mundane. Trees, yellow lines, cracked asphalt. Then her odometer ticked over to kilometer 64. She should have been exiting the highway, but the road continued. She checked her rearview mirror and saw her own tail lights, impossibly distant, like she was looking at herself from miles away. The highway was folding, and she was caught in the crease. She saw other cars then, dozens of them, driving parallel to her through the trees. All the people who'd disappeared, still driving, trapped in their own versions of Highway 517. She recognized Garrett's truck. She saw the Sorensens' car, Emily and Jacob visible through the windows, still together but separated by a gulf of impossible space. Sarah slammed on her brakes and grabbed her radio, calling for backup, screaming her position. Her partner, Detective Wayne Brunel, heard her call from the checkpoint. He drove onto Highway 517, found her car at kilometer 62, parked and empty. Sarah was gone. The highway is closed now. Permanently. Concrete barriers block both ends. The forest is reclaiming the asphalt, roots breaking through, trees growing in the cracks. Thornwood is a ghost town, but sometimes hikers in the area report strange sounds coming from the abandoned highway. The sound of engines that never stop. The sound of radios calling for help. The sound of people who've been driving forever, trapped in the fold, unable to find the exit that should be just ahead. Story 4. The Children of Milbrook Station. Milbrook Station, Saskatchewan, was founded in 1908 as a railway stop on the Transcontinental Line. In the spring of 2001, every child in town stopped aging, and the horror began. Rachel Drummond was a teacher at Millbrook Elementary, a single-story building that served all grades from kindergarten through 8th. She had 43 students in the spring semester, children from farming families whose lives revolved around wheat and weather. The first sign was subtle. Liam Kostik, a third grader, complained that his shoes still fit. His mother, Svetlana, had bought them in September, and by March they should have been too small. 9-year-olds didn't stay the same size for 6 months, but Liam's feet hadn't grown, not a millimeter. Then other parents noticed the same thing. Clothes that should have been outgrown still fit. Height marks on door frames hadn't changed. The town doctor, Vincent Hawthorne, examined the children and found something impossible. They weren't growing. Hair, nails, bones, everything had stopped. The children were frozen in time. Dr. Hawthorne called in specialists from Regina. They ran every test imaginable. The children were healthy by every metric. Their cells divided normally. Their metabolism functioned perfectly. But they weren't getting older, not by a single day. Rachel noticed the behavioral changes first. The children became quieter, more thoughtful. They stared at adults with expressions that seemed too knowing for their years. Little Emma Forrester, a kindergartner who'd struggled to read, suddenly finished chapter books overnight. 12-year-old Dominic LaRoche started discussing philosophical concepts that would challenge university students. Their minds were still developing, still learning and growing. But their bodies had stopped. They were ancient minds trapped in child forms. The parents panicked. Some families left Milbrook, seeking answers in bigger cities, but the children refused to go. They became violent when forced, attacking their own parents with shocking strength. 3 families tried to leave anyway. All 3 cars were found abandoned on the highway 5 kilometers outside town. Parents unconscious in the front seats, children missing. The children came back on their own, walking down the highway in a silent line. They returned to their homes, and their parents, traumatized and confused, didn't try to leave again. Rachel started keeping a journal. She had to document what was happening because it was getting worse. The children had organized themselves into some kind of collective. They moved in groups now, always watching, always whispering to each other. They stopped attending school, said they didn't need it anymore. When Rachel went to their homes to check on them, she found the children teaching their parents, explaining concepts about physics and biology that shouldn't make sense but somehow did. Milbrook Station had 287 residents. 43 were children. The power dynamic was shifting, and the adults felt it. Fear settled over the town like fog. On May 16th, the adults held a secret meeting in the community center. The children weren't invited, but they came anyway. All 43 of them, walking through the door in perfect synchronization. They sat in the back row and listened to the adults discuss them like they weren't there. Liam Kostick stood up. He was still 9 years old, still 4 feet tall, but when he spoke, his voice carried authority that silenced everyone. We know you're afraid. We're afraid too. We don't understand what's happening to us. But we're not your enemy. We're still your children. His mother began to cry. Then let us help you. Let us take you to doctors who can fix this. Liam shook his head. Nothing is wrong with us. We're not broken. We're changing into something else. Something that needs to stay here. Why? Rachel asked. Why do you need to stay in Milbrook? The children looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Emma Forrester answered, her 5-year-old voice unnervingly calm. Because we're holding something down, something under the town. It's been here since before the railway, since before people. We're the lid on the jar, and if we leave, it opens. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some adults thought the children were delusional. Others believed them and were terrified. Dr. Hawthorne demanded to know what was under the town. The children couldn't explain, said they didn't have words for it, that it existed in spaces between thoughts and dreams. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She researched Milbrook's history, looking for anything that might explain this. She found a reference in the town's founding documents, a note from the railway surveyor. He'd reported strange readings in the area, magnetic, anomalies, spots where compasses spun wildly. He'd recommended building the station elsewhere. His recommendation was ignored. She found older records, too, from when the land belonged to the Cree Nation. Stories about this area, warnings passed down through generations. The spot where Milbrook stood was sacred and forbidden. Something slept here, something that had to be watched. Shamans would come here, perform ceremonies, keep vigil. When the railway came, the ceremonies stopped. The watchers left. The children became the new watchers, Rachel realized. They didn't choose this. Something in the land had chosen them, transformed them, locked them into eternal childhood because children's minds were flexible enough to bear the weight of this responsibility. The government got involved in June. Health Canada sent investigators, then the military. They wanted to study the children, take them to facilities for observation. The children refused. When soldiers tried to force them, the ground shook. Not an earthquake, something else, something waking up below. The tremors lasted for 3 minutes. Buildings cracked, the railway tracks buckled, and from the basement of every building in town, people reported hearing sounds. Breathing. Enormous, rhythmic breathing that wasn't quite physical, that you felt in your bones rather than heard with your ears. The soldiers left. The government declared Milbrook Station a restricted zone. The adults who wanted to leave were evacuated. About 100 people stayed. Parents who couldn't abandon their frozen children, others who'd lived here their whole lives and refused to go. Rachel stayed too. She was one of the few adults the children still trusted. They needed someone to help them bridge the gap between what they were becoming and what they'd been. She became their teacher again. But now she was learning as much from them as they learned from her. The children explained it slowly, over months, in ways Rachel's mind could barely grasp. Milbrook Station sat on top of something vast and old, something that existed partially in this reality and partially in others. It was dreaming, had been dreaming for millions of years. The children's job was to keep it asleep, to maintain the barrier between its dreams and the waking world. If it woke fully, Rachel asked, what would happen? The children showed her. They held hands in a circle and opened their minds to her, just for a second. She saw what was underneath Milbrook. She saw its dreams leaking up through the soil. She saw the town as it would be if the sleeper woke, a place where time and space unraveled, where the laws of physics were suggestions, where reality was as fluid as thought. She understood then why the children couldn't age. To hold something timeless in place, you had to exist outside of time yourself. The children of Milbrook Station would be children forever, eternal guardians of a sleeping god they could never fully comprehend. Rachel still lives in Milbrook. She's 53 now, her hair gray, her face lined. The children she taught in 2001 look exactly the same as they did 20 years ago. New children are born in town sometimes, to the families who stayed. Those children develop normally, grow up, leave, but the original 43 remain unchanged. They're good kids, she always says. They play, they laugh, they argue over video games and who gets to choose the movie. They're still children in all the ways that matter. Except sometimes, late at night, Rachel sees them standing in a circle in the middle of Main Street, holding hands, eyes closed, lips moving in silent harmony, keeping vigil, holding down the nightmare, protecting a world that will never know their heroes because it will never know what they've saved it from. Story 5. The Lighthouse Keeper of Raven's Head. Raven's Head Lighthouse stood on a rocky point on the coast of Newfoundland, its beam sweeping across the Atlantic since 1881. In November 2003, the light began showing people things that hadn't happened yet, and the keeper went mad trying to stop what he'd seen. Owen Mackenzie had been the lighthouse keeper for 7 years when the visions started. At 62, he was winding down a career that had been spent in solitary service, maintaining lights along Canada's eastern shore. Raven's Head was his last posting before retirement, and he loved it. The isolation, the rhythm of the waves, the simple routine of keeping the light burning. The lighthouse had been automated in 1987, but the Lighthouse Preservation Society maintained it as a historical site. Owen lived in the keeper's cottage and gave tours to tourists in summer, kept the light operational year-round, more out of tradition than necessity. Modern ships used GPS. The beam was ceremonial, a connection to history. The malfunction started on November 3rd. Owen was performing routine maintenance, cleaning the Fresnel lens, when he noticed something in the beam. A shape, moving in the light itself. At first he thought it was a bird, confused by the brightness. But as he watched, the shape resolved into something impossible. He saw a ship, an oil tanker, massive and modern, breaking apart on the rocks below the lighthouse. He saw it so clearly he could read the name on the hull. Northern Providence. He saw crew members abandoning ship, lifeboats hitting the water. He saw fire spreading across the waves, turning the ocean orange and black. Owen stumbled backward, crashing into his maintenance kit. When he looked again, the vision was gone. The beam swept clean and empty across dark water. No ship, no fire, nothing. He checked the maritime channels. No distress calls, no reports of ships in trouble. He checked online, searching for the Northern Providence. The ship existed, was currently somewhere in the North Sea according to tracking sites. He'd seen a hallucination, probably a trick of light and an aging man's tired eyes. But the next night, the beam showed him something else. A car crash on the highway 5 kilometers inland. He saw it happen in perfect detail. A blue sedan losing control, sliding on black ice, hitting a tree. He saw the driver, a young woman with red hair, slumped over the steering wheel. Owen called the RCMP. He tried to explain what he'd seen, but he sounded insane even to himself. The officer who took the call was polite, but dismissive. There were no reports of crashes. The roads were clear. Perhaps Owen should get some rest. The crash happened 3 days later. Owen heard about it at the general store in Ravens Point, the nearest town. A young woman, tourist from Ontario, had died on the inland highway, hit a patch of ice, crashed into a tree. The description matched what Owen had seen perfectly, down to the color of the car and the victim's red hair. He drove to the crash site. The wreckage was still there, being loaded onto a flatbed truck. One detail froze him in place. The tree the car had hit bore claw marks, deep gouges in the bark. Fresh gouges that couldn't have come from the impact. Something had been at this tree before the crash, marking it. Owen began documenting everything. Every night he watched the beam, and every night it showed him tragedy. A house fire in a nearby town, a fishing boat sinking in a storm, a hunter falling from a tree stand. All of it shone in the light before it happened in reality. The delay was random, sometimes days, sometimes hours, sometimes weeks. He tried to warn people. He called the police, sent emails to local papers, posted warnings online. Everyone thought he was crazy or senile or both. The lighthouse keeper who'd spent too many years alone, seeing patterns in randomness, inventing disasters. But Owen knew better. The beam was showing him the future. And something was causing these disasters, orchestrating them. He saw it in the details, the claw marks on trees before car crashes. Strange symbols scratched into the hulls of boats that would later sink. Burn patterns in houses before they caught fire. Patterns that looked deliberate, ritualistic. Something was marking its targets. And the lighthouse beam was revealing its plans. Owen started trying to intervene directly. Before the fishing boat sank, he sabotaged its engine, forcing the crew to cancel their trip. They were furious, nearly had him arrested. The boat never sank because it never left harbor. The timeline had changed. He felt victorious until the beam showed him something new. The same fishing crew, but dying differently. Their truck went off a bridge. The beam was adapting, showing him that whatever force was at work wouldn't be stopped so easily. Death would find its marks one way or another. He saved a family from a house fire by triggering the fire alarm before the fire started, making them evacuate. The house still burned. The family lived. But a week later, the beam showed him the same family dying in a different fire, this one in their hotel room. Owen realized the horrible truth. He couldn't stop the deaths. He could only delay them, change their method. Whatever was doing this was relentless. It had a list, and it was working through it systematically. He started researching the victims, looking for connections. It took months, but he found it. Every person the beam showed him, every victim marked for death, had been involved in the same incident 20 years earlier. The wreck of the fishing vessel Mary Catherine on the rocks below Raven's Head. 27 people had died when the Mary Catherine sank in a November storm in 1983. The storm had been unexpected, unprecedented. The lighthouse's beam had been operational, but the ship had somehow missed it, sailed straight onto the rocks as if blind. The survivors had testified at the inquiry. They said the beam was there, but it showed them something else. Not clear water, but more rocks, a wall of stone where the safe channel should be. They'd steered away from the illusion and hit the real rocks instead. The inquiry dismissed their testimony as trauma-induced confusion. The lighthouse was functioning normally, but Owen understood. The beam had shown an illusion then, just as it showed truth now. It had caused the wreck of the Mary Catherine. And now, something, the spirits of the drowned, the sea itself seeking balance, was extracting revenge on everyone who'd survived. The beam was both weapon and warning. It had killed 27. Now it was showing him the deaths of the survivors, letting him watch helplessly as fate corrected itself. Owen found the list of survivors from the inquiry report. 38 people had lived through the wreck. He checked obituaries. 15 had died of natural causes over the years. 20 had died in the accidents the beam had predicted. 3 remained. One was Owen himself. He'd been assistant keeper in 1983, working the night the Mary Catherine went down. He'd been the one manning the light. He'd seen the beam flicker, seen something move in the lens, but told the inquiry nothing was wrong because he couldn't explain what he'd witnessed. The beam showed him his own death on March 19, 2004. He saw himself in the lighthouse, saw the lens shatter, saw glass pierce his body in 100 places, saw himself bleed out on the stairs, alone, the beam finally dark. He had 2 choices. He could run, abandon the lighthouse, try to escape his fate, or he could face it and perhaps break the cycle. He chose to stay. On March 19th, as the sun set, Owen climbed to the lamp room. He'd spent the day preparing, had recorded everything in letters to the newspapers, to the Lighthouse Preservation Society, to anyone who might listen. He'd documented every vision, every death, every detail of the curse that had turned Raven's Head's beam into an instrument of prophecy and revenge. The beam activated at dusk. Owen saw his death in the light, exactly as predicted. He saw the lens crack, saw himself try to run, saw the glass catch him anyway. The vision was clear, unavoidable. He did the only thing he could think of. He smashed the lens himself, took a fire axe, and shattered the Fresnel lens into 1,000,000 pieces. Glass rained down, cutting his hands and face, but he was ready for it, wearing heavy clothes and goggles. The beam died. The lighthouse went dark for the first time in 123 years. Owen survived the night. He survived because he'd changed the method, chosen his wounds instead of accepting fate's version. But the next morning, when he looked out at the ocean, he saw something that made his blood freeze. The beam was still active. Despite the shattered lens, despite the dead bulb, light was sweeping across the water. Not from the lighthouse, but from the ocean itself, rising from the spot where the Mary Catherine had sunk. The beam was emerging from the deep, and it was no longer showing him the future. It was showing him the past. He saw the wreck happening again, the Mary Catherine breaking apart. But this time, he saw what had caused it. Something vast moving beneath the ship. Something with edges that didn't make sense geometrically. Something that existed in more dimensions than his eyes could process. It had risen from the deep trench east of Raven's Head, attracted by the lighthouse beam like an insect to flame. The beam hadn't malfunctioned in 1983. It had been hijacked, used as a lure by something that fed on disaster, on death, on the psychic energy of tragedy. The entity had drawn the Mary Catherine onto the rocks, fed on the deaths, and sunk back into the trench. Now it was rising again. Owen understood with crystal clarity. The lighthouse beam hadn't been showing him the deaths to warn him. It had been showing him because the entity wanted him to watch, wanted him to feel helpless, wanted to feed on his despair and guilt. Every death he'd witnessed, every failed attempt to stop fate, had been nourishment for the thing in the deep. He was the last survivor, the last source of that particular flavor of anguish. Once he was dead, the cycle would complete, and the entity would sink back into dormancy, satisfied, until the next time ships passed close enough to lure. Owen made a choice then. If his death would complete the cycle, he'd deny the entity that satisfaction. He wouldn't die in the lighthouse. He wouldn't die in any way the beam had shown him. He'd live deliberately, stubbornly, carrying his guilt and knowledge as long as his body would allow. He moved away from Raven's Head, sold everything, moved to Calgary, as far from the ocean as he could get. He lived carefully, avoided every danger. He kept himself alive through sheer bloody-minded determination, denying the entity its final meal. Owen Mackenzie is 83 years old now. He lives in a retirement home in Alberta, has outlived his predictions by 2 decades. The lighthouse at Ravenshead was decommissioned, the ruins left to the elements. But on November nights, fishermen report seeing lights on the point, beams sweeping across the water. And sometimes, they see things in those beams. Things that haven't happened yet. Things that will happen, unless someone is watching, someone who understands, someone who refuses to let the cycle complete. Owen hasn't been back to Newfoundland since 2004, but he follows the news from the coastal towns. He tracks the accidents, the unusual deaths. He's looking for a pattern, proof that the entity is still active, still trying to complete its cycle. Some nights he lies awake and wonders if his survival has made things worse, if by breaking the pattern he's condemned future people to take his place. But he's still alive. He's still watching, and as long as he breathes, the cycle stays broken, and the thing in the deep stays hungry. Story 6. The Puppeteer of Willowbend. Willowbend, Quebec, was a bilingual town of 634 souls straddling the Ontario border. In the summer of 2005, people began moving like they were being controlled by invisible strings, and the police found something in the woods that explained everything and nothing at all. It started with Isabelle Dupont, a server at the town's only restaurant, Le Hibou Bleu. On June 7th, in the middle of the lunch rush, Isabelle suddenly stopped taking orders. Her arms lifted slowly, perpendicular to her body, like a puppet's arms pulled by strings. Her head tilted back, mouth open, eyes rolled up until only whites showed. She stood like that for 30 seconds while customers stared in horror. Then her arms dropped, her head snapped forward, and she continued working as if nothing had happened. When her manager, Claude Baudouin, asked if she was okay, Isabelle looked confused. She had no memory of the incident. One moment she was taking an order, the next she was standing at a different table, time missing from her experience. Over the next week, it happened to 12 more people. Always sudden, always the same pose. Arms out, head back, like marionettes waiting for their master's command. The episodes lasted between 20 seconds and 2 minutes. Afterward, the victims remembered nothing. Dr. Helene Marcoux examined the affected individuals. She found no common medical condition, no drugs in their systems, no neurological explanation. Their movements during the episodes were too coordinated to be seizures. It was like something external was manipulating them, testing them, trying them on. Philippe Guertin was the 13th case, and his episode was different. The construction foreman stopped in the middle of a work site, arms rising, head tilting back. But then he began to walk. His movement was jerky, unnatural, like stop-motion animation. He walked across the site, navigating obstacles perfectly despite his eyes showing only whites. He walked to the edge of the forest and stopped, standing at the tree line for 5 minutes before the control released him. He came back confused and terrified. He'd felt something during the episode, he said. Presence, intelligence, the sensation of being worn like a coat, something else sliding into his body and looking out through his eyes. Sergeant Thomas Ouellet of the Sûreté du Québec began investigating. He thought it might be environmental, contaminated water, gas leak, something physical. But tests showed nothing. He expanded his search, looking for patterns. All the victims lived in Willowbend. All were adults between 25 and 60. No children had been affected. Not yet. On June 21st, the summer solstice, it happened to 40 people simultaneously. At 2:17 p.m., 40 residents stopped what they were doing, assumed the puppet pose, and began to walk. They converged on the forest north of town, moving in perfect unison despite being scattered across Willowbend when the control took them. Thomas and every available officer followed the procession. The victims walked into the woods in a single file line, still moving with that jerky, unnatural gait. They walked for 3 kilometers, deeper into the forest than most locals ever went, to a clearing that wasn't on any map. In the center of the clearing stood a structure. At first, Thomas thought it was an art installation, maybe something left over from a festival. But as he got closer, he realized it was old, ancient. The structure was made of wood, but the wood was wrong, too smooth, too uniform, like it had been grown rather than carved. It stood 15 feet tall, shaped roughly like a cross, with dozens of thin branches extending from the main posts. The branches moved. Not in the wind. There was no wind in the clearing. They moved deliberately, curling and uncurling like fingers, and from each branch hung a single thread, so thin it was barely visible, stretching up into the canopy above and disappearing into the leaves. Thomas looked up and saw them. Hundreds of threads, maybe thousands, spreading through the trees like a spider's web, extending in all directions through the forest. The threads were so fine they were nearly invisible, but in the late afternoon light, they caught the sun and glowed faintly, turning the forest canopy into a vast net of silver lines. The 40 people stood at the edge of the clearing, still in their puppet poses, heads tilted back. The threads were attached to them. Thomas could see the connection points now: fingers, wrists, elbows, shoulders, neck, jaw. Invisible threads running from the structure's branches to the people, controlling them like marionettes. As Thomas watched, the structure began to move. The wooden frame shifted, branches extending, and the people moved in response. They began to dance, all 40 of them, movements synchronized perfectly. It was beautiful and horrifying, a performance choreographed by something that understood human motion, but wasn't human itself. Thomas tried to approach the structure. The moment he stepped into the clearing, he felt threads touch him. He couldn't see them, but he felt them, like spider silk brushing his skin. They tried to attach, tried to find purchase on his body. He stumbled backward, and the threads released him, snapping back towards the structure. The dance lasted for 10 minutes. The people moved through complex choreography, their bodies bending and flowing in ways that should have been graceful, but were slightly wrong, slightly off, like a computer's approximation of dance programmed by something that had observed humans but never been one. Then it stopped. The threads detached, snapping back into the structure with a sound like twanging wires. The 40 people collapsed. Thomas and the other officers rushed forward to help them. They were unconscious but breathing, vital signs normal. They woke up over the next hour, confused and disoriented, remembering nothing. Thomas called for backup, for specialists, for anyone who might understand what he was looking at. The Quebec government sent researchers, anthropologists, biologists. They examined the structure for 3 days, took samples, ran tests. The wood was unlike anything in their databases. Cellulose structure too organized, too perfect. It was biological, but not natural. Grown, but not by any plant species they could identify. The threads were even stranger. They couldn't be collected. When cut, they dissolved into nothing. When measured, they gave inconsistent readings, appearing to exist in more than 3 spatial dimensions. The researchers couldn't explain them, couldn't even properly photograph them. They showed up on digital cameras as faint streaks, on film as nothing at all. Dr. Marie Blanchard, an anthropologist from Université Laval, found similar structures documented in historical records. Indigenous communities across Quebec and Ontario had stories about the puppeteer trees, sites that had to be avoided, especially on solstice days. The structures were said to be lures created by something that existed partly in the spirit world, something that wanted to understand physical beings by wearing them, controlling them, learning how they moved. The structures appeared every few centuries, grew in isolated forests, spread their threads, and collected puppets. After gathering enough information, enough experience, they would dissolve back into the earth, and the controlling entity would retreat to wherever it came from. Usually the process took decades. The people who got caught in the threads would be controlled for hours or days, then released, disoriented but unharmed. But the Willowbend structure was different. According to carbon dating, it was only 3 years old. It was growing faster than any recorded case, and it was already controlling people in larger numbers, keeping them connected for longer periods. It was accelerating, learning faster than its historical counterparts. The government decided to destroy it. On July 1st, a team arrived with industrial equipment, planning to cut down the structure and burn it. Thomas tried to warn them, but they were confident, professional. They had protocols for hazardous biological phenomena. The team entered the clearing at dawn. The structure waited, branches still, threads invisible. The moment the first chainsaw touched wood, the threads activated. They shot out in all directions, moving faster than the eye could follow. Every member of the team was caught, controlled, threads attaching to them in dozens of places. Thomas watched from outside the clearing as the team began to move. They formed a circle around the structure, chainsaws discarded. They raised their arms, tilted their heads back, and began to sing. All of them harmonizing in a language Thomas had never heard, syllables that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull. The structure grew. While the team sang, the wooden frame extended, new branches sprouting, threads multiplying. It was feeding on the team's energy, using their controlled bodies as anchors to expand its reach. The threads spread further into the forest, connecting to trees, to rocks, to the earth itself. Thomas called for evacuation. Willowbend was cleared. 600 people relocated to surrounding towns, while specialists figured out what to do. But people kept being drawn back. Residents would get in their cars, drive to the forest, walk to the clearing. The structure's influence was spreading. The threads were invisible but pervasive, and they were learning. By August, the structure controlled a 20-kilometer radius. Anyone who entered the zone felt the threads attach. Most could resist if they stayed alert, if they kept moving. But the moment you relaxed, the moment you let your guard down, the threads took hold, and the structure learned a little more about how to be human. The clearing became a research site. The Government built a perimeter, maintained constant surveillance. The structure couldn't be destroyed. Every attempt at damage made it grow faster. It couldn't be contained. The threads passed through barriers like they weren't there. All they could do was monitor it and keep people away. But Dr. Blanchard found something in her research that gave her hope. The historical structures had all eventually collapsed. After gathering enough information, after wearing enough puppets, the controlling entity would lose interest. It would withdraw, and the structure would rot, dissolving into the forest floor over a few weeks. The question was how long? How many people would it need to control? How much learning was enough? Willowbend is still evacuated. The perimeter around the forest is maintained by a rotating team of observers who work 2-hour shifts maximum, never alone, always watched by partners who can pull them back if the threads take hold. The structure continues to grow. The clearing is now a cathedral of threads, a vast web that catches the light and glows like captured starlight. Thomas still lives near the perimeter. He's retired from the Sûreté but volunteers as an observer. He watches the clearing through binoculars, watches the threads move and pulse. Sometimes he sees shapes in the web, shadows of the 40 people who danced, who sang, who fed the structure enough energy for it to grow beyond anything in the historical records. He's waiting for it to die, for the entity to lose interest and withdraw. But he's starting to suspect that won't happen. This structure is different. It's not just learning how to wear human bodies. It's learning how to be permanent. It's figuring out how to stay, how to make this forest its eternal hunting ground. And when it finishes learning, when it perfects its technique, Thomas fears the threads will spread beyond the perimeter, beyond the forest, into towns and cities, until every person in Quebec and beyond feels invisible. Strings attached to their skin, feels their body stop belonging to them, feels themselves become puppets dancing for an audience that exists outside human understanding, wearing them like costumes, learning how to move exactly like a person until the entity doesn't need the real ones anymore. Story 7. The broadcast from Deadwood Lake. Deadwood Lake, Alberta, was a logging community slowly dying as the timber industry collapsed. In winter 2007, a radio signal appeared on every frequency, broadcasting a warning that nobody wanted to believe. Mitchell Crane was a radio technician who'd moved to Deadwood Lake for the cheap rent and quiet life. He ran a small repair shop, fixed CB radios for truckers, ham equipment for hobbyists. It was simple work that left him alone, which was how he liked it after 20 years in the military and 10 more in corporate telecommunications. On January 4th, every radio in town started picking up the same signal. It didn't matter what frequency you were tuned to. AM, FM, shortwave, CB, the same broadcast came through. Static at first, then a voice, male, calm, speaking English with no discernible accent. This is a warning to the residents of Deadwood Lake. You need to leave. You have 48 hours. Take whatever you can carry and go. Do not ask questions. Do not investigate. Just leave. The broadcast repeated every 15 minutes. Mitchell tracked the signal, trying to triangulate its source. His equipment told him it was coming from everywhere and nowhere, broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously without any identifiable origin point. That shouldn't be possible. Radio signals had sources, transmitters, power supplies. This signal appeared to be spontaneous, materializing out of the electromagnetic spectrum itself. The town reacted with confusion and irritation. People assumed it was a prank, maybe something the teenagers had rigged up. The RCMP investigated, but found no equipment, no transmitter. The signal continued. 36 hours remaining. Please leave. What's coming cannot be stopped. We tried to warn others before. They didn't listen. Please be smarter. Mayor Douglas Fenwick held an emergency council meeting. The broadcast was disrupting everything. Businesses couldn't communicate. Emergency services had no reliable radio contact. Cell phones worked, but the tower was 30 kilometers away, and coverage was spotty. The town depended on radio. Mitchell attended the meeting. He explained what he'd found. The signal was impossible by conventional physics. It wasn't being transmitted in any normal sense. It was manifesting. He suggested they at least investigate, try to figure out what the warning was about. 24 hours remaining. We know you think this is fake. It's not. Check your history. Deadwood Lake, 1957. The first settlement here vanished. All 43 people gone in one night. They received the same warning. They ignored it. The meeting erupted. Everyone knew the story of the original Deadwood Lake settlement. It was local legend. In 1957, a logging camp had been established here. 3 months later, the entire camp had been found empty. 43 people gone without a trace. No signs of violence, no indication of where they went. Their belongings were all still there. Food still on tables. Beds still warm. The mystery had never been solved. The current town had been founded on the same site in 1962, and nothing unusual had happened in 45 years. The story was just a story, explained away by dozens of rational theories. The workers had fled debts, joined a cult, been killed by wildlife, and their bodies lost in the forest. Nobody seriously believed they'd simply vanished. But the broadcast continued. 12 hours remaining. It happens every 50 years. The cycle is regular. 1957, 2007. When the alignment is correct, when the dimensions shift, this place becomes accessible. Something comes through, something hungry. People started leaving. Not many. Maybe 30 out of Deadwood Lake's 278 residents. They packed their cars and drove to Grande Prairie, to Edmonton, anywhere else. The rest stayed, either because they didn't believe the warning or because they had nowhere else to go. Mitchell stayed because he needed to know. He spent the last 12 hours setting up equipment throughout the town. Cameras, seismographs, electromagnetic sensors, everything he could deploy. If something was going to happen, he was going to document it. 2 hours remaining. For those who are still there, we're sorry. We don't know how to help you. The ones who come, they're not from here. Not from anywhere you can understand. They don't kill. They take. You'll still be alive, but you won't be here anymore. You'll be somewhere else, doing something you can't imagine, serving a purpose you'll never comprehend. The broadcast changed tone for the final warning. The calm voice cracked, showing emotion for the first time. 1 hour remaining. To whoever is recording this, whoever is trying to understand, we were you once. We lived in Deadwood Lake. We ignored the warning. We thought we were rational people who wouldn't fall for superstition. The cycle took us. Now we're elsewhere. We can send these warnings back, but we can't come back ourselves. We've been gone for 50 years, but we experience time differently now. It's been thousands of years for us. Millions, maybe. We don't know anymore. Please leave. Don't let this happen to you. Mitchell felt cold dread settle into his stomach. The voice wasn't coming from 1957. It was coming from the people who'd vanished, broadcasting backward through time from wherever they'd been taken. They'd been trying to warn their past selves, and now they were warning the current residents, knowing exactly how it would play out, because they'd lived through it already. The final broadcast came at 11:47 p.m. It's starting. We can feel it from here. The dimensions are aligning. The barrier is thin. They're coming through. To whoever survives, tell our families we didn't abandon them. We didn't choose this. And we're still alive, somewhere, somehow. We've been alive for 50 years that felt like eternity. In 2057, you'll have a chance to warn the next group, if you're still capable of speech by then. If you remember language, if you remember being human, goodbye. The radios went silent. Every frequency, completely dead. Mitchell's equipment registered a massive electromagnetic pulse, but not like any EMP he'd ever documented. This pulse bent wrong, moved through space in ways that didn't follow straight lines. Then the sky changed. Mitchell was outside, camera in hand, and he saw it happen. The stars above Deadwood Lake shifted position. Just slightly, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. The constellations were wrong. Orion's belt bent, the Big Dipper inverted. He felt the air pressure change. His ears popped like he was ascending rapidly, but he was standing still. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 30 seconds. His breath crystallized instantly, falling to the ground as frozen vapor that shattered like glass. They came through the spaces between things. Mitchell saw them in his peripheral vision, couldn't look at them directly because his eyes wouldn't focus on their forms. They existed partially in dimensions he couldn't perceive, so his brain saw only fragments, pieces of geometry that didn't connect properly, colors that didn't exist in normal light. They moved through the town efficiently, purposefully. Mitchell tried to run, but his body wouldn't respond. Not because he was paralyzed. He could feel his muscles, could feel himself moving. But he was moving in directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. He was running upward through time, backward through space, sideways through dimensions he didn't have words for. He saw his neighbors experiencing the same thing. Mayor Fenwick screaming silently as he stretched into impossible shapes. The Kaufman family holding hands as they folded through themselves like origami. Everyone was being taken, pulled into wherever the entities came from, through gaps in reality that shouldn't exist but were opening anyway. Mitchell's last coherent thought before the translation completed was that the warning had been accurate. He wasn't dying. He was being taken. His consciousness was intact, but it was moving into spaces where human consciousness wasn't designed to function. Then he was there. Elsewhere. A place that couldn't be described because human language evolved for 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension, and this place had more. Many more. He could see in directions that didn't have names. He could feel the presence of his neighbors, the 248 people who'd stayed in Deadwood Lake. But they weren't people anymore. They were perspectives, viewpoints, tools being used by entities to observe realities that those entities couldn't directly perceive. Humans, Mitchell realized with growing horror, were like microscopes. The entities were using them to look into the three-dimensional universe, using human perception as a lens to examine realities they were too vast to enter themselves. He tried to scream, and found he couldn't. Not because he lacked a mouth. He could feel his body, or something like his body, still existed. But sound didn't work here. Communication happened directly, thought to thought, and the entities were already using him, looking through him, seeing the three-dimensional world he'd come from, studying it with academic interest, disassembling his memories to understand the universe he'd left behind. Time passed. Or didn't pass. Mitchell couldn't tell anymore. Subjectively, it felt like years, decades, centuries. But he knew somehow that back in Deadwood Lake, only seconds had elapsed. Time was another direction here, and he was moving through it at a different rate than the universe he'd come from. He became aware of the others, the ones who'd been taken in 1957. They were still here, still being used as observation tools. They'd been here for 50 years, but subjectively, they'd experienced millions of years of consciousness. They'd been aware for every moment, unable to sleep, unable to rest, just endlessly serving as lenses for entities that studied realities the way humans study microorganisms. They'd found a way to send messages back. It took them thousands of subjective years to learn, but they'd figured out how to manipulate electromagnetic fields in the three-dimensional universe from their position in this higher dimensional space. The warnings, the broadcasts, their desperate attempt to save others from their fate. And Mitchell understood. In 50 years, it would be his turn. In 2057, the cycle would repeat. The dimensions would align again, and new people would settle Deadwood Lake because humans always forgot, always rationalized, always convinced themselves that the impossible couldn't happen. He would send warnings. He would broadcast backward through time, trying to save them. And they wouldn't listen. Just like he hadn't listened. Just like the people in 1957 hadn't listened to warnings from whatever group had been taken in 1907, or 1857, or whenever the cycle had started. The entities didn't care. To them, this was simple resource harvesting. Humans were useful tools, and Deadwood Lake was a regular collection point where the barriers were thin enough for retrieval. The fact that those humans experienced subjective eternities of conscious exploitation was irrelevant. Tools don't have rights. Deadwood Lake was empty the next morning. Search and rescue teams arrived to find 248 people missing. No signs of struggle. No indication of where they'd gone. Houses intact, cars in driveways, food still on tables. It was 1957 all over again, and the official explanations were the same. Mass hysteria, cult behavior, elaborate hoax. The town never recovered. Nobody resettled it. The buildings rot slowly in the Alberta wilderness. Radio operators sometimes pick up strange signals from the area, broadcasts that warn of danger, that beg people to stay away. Most dismiss them as pranks or atmospheric anomalies, but in 2057, someone will buy the land cheap. Someone will see opportunity in the empty buildings and cheap property. A new Deadwood Lake will be founded. And 50 years after being taken, Mitchell Crane will send warnings backward through time, manipulating electromagnetic fields from his prison in higher dimensional space, using skills learned over subjective millennia of consciousness. And whoever receives those warnings will do exactly what he did. They'll investigate. They'll rationalize. They'll stay. Because humans always do. Because we can't truly believe in horrors that our brains aren't designed to comprehend. Because we're tools that collect themselves, making the entities work so much easier. Story 8. The Recursion of St. Terz. St. Terz, New Brunswick, population 391, was famous for one thing: the annual Festival of Mirrors held every August. In 2008, someone brought the wrong mirror to the festival, and the town began repeating itself. Francine LeBlanc had organized the festival for 12 years. It was a quirky local tradition started in the 1960s when a mirror manufacturing plant had briefly operated in town. The festival celebrated that history with mirror art installations, funhouse mirrors set up throughout the downtown, activities for kids involving reflection and light. It was small-town charm at its finest, drawing maybe 500 visitors annually. The trouble started with Dominic Arsenault's contribution. Dominic was a collector, specialized in antique mirrors. He'd acquired a piece from an estate sale in Montreal, a full-length mirror in an ornate frame, dating to the 1890s. The glass was perfect, no warping or silver degradation despite its age. He installed it in the town square as part of the festival's centerpiece exhibit. The first person to look into it was Francine herself, checking the installation on August 15th, the morning the festival opened. She glanced at her reflection, adjusting her hair, and felt something wrong. Her reflection moved slightly differently than she did. Not much, just a fraction of a second delayed, like watching herself on video with lag. She blinked, and the delay corrected. She convinced herself it was fatigue. She'd been working 18-hour days preparing for the festival. The first real incident happened at noon. Celeste Robichaud, a tourist from Quebec City, took a photo of herself in front of the antique mirror. When she checked the image on her camera, she saw herself in the frame, but her reflection in the mirror was facing the wrong direction. In the photo, Mirror Celeste was looking at real Celeste, making eye contact with the camera despite the angle being wrong for that. Celeste showed Francine who looked at the mirror and saw only normal reflections. She suggested the camera had glitched. The image had corrupted. Celeste deleted the photo, uncomfortable, and left the festival early. More people reported oddities throughout the day, reflections that blinked at slightly different times, shadows that fell at angles inconsistent with the sun's position. A child who swore his reflection waved at him before he waved at it. By evening, Francine decided to remove the mirror from the display. But when she approached it with Dominic to take it down, they discovered something that froze them both in place. The mirror was reflecting the town square, but the reflection was wrong. In the mirror, the festival was still in full swing, crowds of people visible, though the real square had mostly emptied as evening fell. They could see themselves in the reflection, standing in front of the mirror. But behind mirror, then, the square was packed with people who weren't there in reality. Mirror Francine turned and looked at the crowd, even though real Francine was standing still, staring at the mirror. Dominic reached out to touch the glass. His hand made contact, but instead of feeling solid glass, his fingers sank into the surface like it was water. He yanked his hand back, and the mirror rippled, surface undulating like disturbed liquid before solidifying again. They covered the mirror with a tarp and secured it, planning to remove it in the morning. But that night, people in St. Terz started seeing doubles, not reflections, actual duplicates of themselves walking around town. Multiple residents reported encountering themselves on the street, watching their duplicate behave slightly differently than they would, making choices they wouldn't make. Auguste Poirier encountered his duplicate in his own kitchen. He'd come downstairs for water at 2 a.m. and found himself already there, sitting at the table, drinking coffee and reading a book Auguste had never started. The duplicate looked up, made eye contact, and smiled. "You should go back to bed," the duplicate said. "I'll handle this iteration." Auguste ran, called the police. But when Constable Marie Gagnon arrived, there was only one Auguste, confused and terrified, insisting his duplicate had been there moments before. The duplicates appeared throughout the town that night. Some people saw just one. Others reported dozens of themselves, each one slightly different, living slightly different versions of the same life. The duplicates weren't hostile, weren't violent. They were just there, existing in parallel, occupying the same space as the originals, but not quite overlapping. By morning, St. Terz had a problem. Every person in town existed in multiple versions. Francine found 3 of herself in her house. One sleeping in her bed, one making breakfast, one sitting on the porch watching the sunrise. She could interact with them, could touch them, and they felt real, solid. They spoke to her with her voice, knew everything she knew, but they made different decisions, followed different impulses. The town council convened an emergency session, but the meeting was chaos. Each council member arrived in duplicate or triplicate, and nobody could agree which version should participate. Mayor Bernard Theriault tried to take control, but there were 4 of him, each insisting they were the original. Dominic remembered the mirror. He drove to the town square and found the tarp removed, the mirror exposed again. But now the reflection showed something terrifying. The mirror was reflecting St. Terz, but it was reflecting thousands of versions of it, infinite iterations, each one slightly different, all existing simultaneously. He understood then what the mirror was doing. It wasn't reflecting light. It was reflecting possibility, reflecting every potential version of reality that could exist in this location. And somehow, those possibilities were bleeding through into actual reality, manifesting as duplicates. He tried to break the mirror, threw a rock at it. The rock passed through the surface like it was passing through water, creating ripples but causing no damage. The mirror couldn't be destroyed because it wasn't really a mirror anymore. It was a window into infinite possibility, and it had opened too wide. Dr. Simone Belliveau, the town's physician, tried a different approach. She theorized that if the mirror was showing all possible versions of Saint Terz, then somewhere in those infinite reflections was a version where the mirror never came to town, where the festival never happened, where reality was still singular. She organized a group. One version of herself, one version of Francine, one version of Dominic, and they entered the mirror together. Not by breaking it, but by accepting its nature. They stepped forward, let the surface accept them, and passed through into the reflection. What they found on the other side was overwhelming. Saint Terz existed in infinite permutations, and they were standing in one of them. But this version was recursive. It contained all the others. They could see through layers of reality like looking through stacked panes of glass, each pane showing a slightly different version of the town. They searched for the original iteration, the Saint Terz, where the mirror had never been displayed. They walked through layers of probability, passing through versions where the festival had failed, where Dominic had never bought the mirror, where the town had burned down in the 1950s, where Saint Terz had never been founded at all. Time worked differently in the recursion. They walked for what felt like hours, but might have been days or years or seconds. The layers pressed in on them, probability crushing probability, infinite choices collapsing into infinite outcomes. Simone found it, the original layer. She could tell because it was the only one where the mirror didn't exist in the town square. This was the root iteration, the prime reality from which all the others had branched. But it was behind so many layers of possibility that reaching it seemed impossible. Francine had an idea. If they could bring something from the original layer back through all the intervening layers, something that definitively proved which reality was real, then maybe all the duplicates would collapse. Reality would reassert singularity, and the mirror's power would break. They needed something that existed in only one version, something that couldn't duplicate. Simone realized information, a secret known by only one person in only one iteration. If they could find someone in the original layer and learn something nobody else knew, they could carry that information back, and it would prove which iteration was prime. They navigated deeper, pushing through layers of probability. In one version, Saint Terz was underwater, the entire region flooded by climate change. In another, the town was a thriving metropolis, somehow grown to millions. In another, humanity was gone, and the town was ruins overgrown by forest. They reached the prime layer by following the thread of least resistance, seeking the version of Saint Terz that required the fewest coincidences, the fewest divergences from expected causality. They found Francine's prime self, the original, explaining the situation. Prime Francine told them something nobody else could know. The combination to a safe in her basement that she'd never shared with anyone, not even her husband. She'd written down her darkest secret and locked it away, intending never to reveal it. They carried that information back, climbing through layers of recursion. The knowledge acted like an anchor, giving them direction, pulling them toward reality. They emerged from the mirror in the town square, back in the version of Saint Terz where the crisis had started. They went to Francine's house, or rather to the house owned by the Francine who'd entered the mirror with them. The basement safe was there. They entered the combination, 173309. The safe opened. Inside was a note in Francine's handwriting. I was driving the night Jacques Devereaux died. Everyone thought it was a hit and run by a stranger. It was me. I was 17. I never told anyone. The secret proved it. This was the real Francine, connected to the prime iteration by knowledge that existed nowhere else. And with that proof, reality began to reassert itself. The duplicates throughout St. Terz started fading, not disappearing, collapsing. All the versions of each person were merging back into singular individuals, all the branching probabilities converging on the prime iteration. People experienced it as sudden influxes of memory, feeling themselves living through multiple versions of the past day simultaneously, all those experiences compressing into single streams of consciousness. The mirror cracked. Really cracked this time, glass fracturing from the center outward. It shattered, falling to the ground, becoming normal glass again, just broken pieces of silver-backed mirror reflecting only what was really there. St. Terz stabilized. The duplicates were gone. But everyone who'd lived through the recursion remembered. They remembered living parallel lives, making different choices, seeing how things could have been. Some people were grateful. They'd seen versions of themselves making mistakes, and they could avoid those paths now. Others were devastated, having glimpsed better lives in other iterations, knowing those possibilities were now closed to them forever. Francine turned herself in for the death of Jacques Devereaux, a hit-and-run from 1979. The confession shocked the town, but it also closed a case that had haunted families for 30 years. She served 3 years for vehicular manslaughter and failure to remain at the scene. The Festival of Mirrors was never held again. The mirrors were removed from the town square, all of them destroyed. St. Terz developed a superstition about reflective surfaces. Most residents covered their mirrors, hung curtains over windows at night, avoided looking at themselves. The trauma of seeing your infinite possible selves doesn't heal easily. Dominic Arsenault never collected another mirror. He sold everything he owned and moved to the Yukon, seeking a place where the population was so low and the spaces so vast that probability couldn't branch as densely, where there was only room for one version of reality. Dr. Simone Béliveau wrote a book about the incident under a pseudonym, tried to warn people about the dangers of contemplating infinity too directly. It was dismissed as fiction, published by a small press, read by almost nobody. But sometimes, late at night, people in St. Terz catch glimpses in their covered mirrors, fleeting images of the lives they could have lived. The recursion is over, but the memory of infinite possibility lingers, whispering to them about all the choices they didn't make, all the people they could have been, all the versions of themselves that collapsed back into singularity but left echoes behind, forever haunting the edges of their perception. Story 9. The Painted People of Red Bluff. Red Bluff, British Columbia, was an artist colony built around a failed mine. In autumn 2010, a painter arrived who could capture people's souls on canvas, and the town learned that some art should never be created. Katarina Holst appeared in Red Bluff on October 1st, with no warning, no announcement. She rented the old assay office, converted into a studio, unpacked her supplies, and hung a sign. Portraits, one sitting, your true self revealed. The price was reasonable, $50, and the town was curious. Red Bluff attracted artists, cheap rent, beautiful scenery, a community that valued creative expression. The population of 212 included painters, sculptors, writers, musicians, all drawn to this remote location where art could flourish without commercial pressure. A new portraitist was welcome. Imogen Fairweather was the first to sit for Katarina. Imogen was a sculptor who'd lived in Red Bluff for 5 years, known for her abstract work in metal and stone. She sat for 3 hours while Katarina painted, working in oils with a speed that seemed impossible, capturing detail Imogen couldn't believe could be rendered so quickly. When the portrait was finished, Imogen stared at it in confusion. The painting showed her, definitely her face, her features, but the expression was wrong. In the painting, Imogen looked afraid, haunted, desperate in a way she'd never felt. "That's not me," she said. Katerina smiled. "It's the you that exists beneath the surface. Your true self." Imogen paid, took the painting home, hung it in her studio. She tried to ignore the expression on her painted face, tried to focus on the technical brilliance of the work. But over the following days, she felt strange, hollow, like something had been removed from her. She sculpted, but her work felt mechanical, uninspired. The passion that had driven her art for decades was simply gone. More people sat for Katerina. Trevor Mackenzie, a writer. Bridget O., a photographer. Simon Duchamp, a musician. Each left with a portrait that showed them in ways they didn't recognize, expressions of fear, anger, or despair that didn't match their actual emotional states. And each began to feel empty afterward, like their interior lives had been drained. By October 20th, 23 people had commissioned portraits. All of them reported the same sensation: a loss of self, a flatness where complexity used to exist. Imogen stopped creating art entirely, spent her days staring at her portrait, unable to look away. Trevor hadn't written a word since his sitting. Bridget couldn't bring herself to touch her camera. Simon's guitar sat untouched in the corner. But they all said the same thing. The portrait was accurate. As they lived with the paintings, they realized Katerina had somehow captured something real, something they'd been hiding even from themselves. Imogen's fear, Trevor's anger, Bridget's despair. These weren't invented. They were real emotions the subjects had been suppressing, and now those feelings were trapped in the paintings, while the living people were left with only emptiness. Marcus Pennington, who ran Red Bluff's general store, refused to sit for a portrait. He'd noticed the change in his neighbors, seen the deadness in their eyes. He confronted Katerina, demanded to know what she was doing. She was honest with him. "I paint the truth, the emotional truth that people hide. When you suppress feelings for years, they accumulate. They form a kind of second self. I capture that self, separate it from the conscious person, and preserve it in my work. It's liberating for them. They're freed from the burden of hidden emotions." "You're stealing parts of their souls," Marcus said. "Souls is such a dramatic word. I prefer to think of it as extraction." They consented. They sat for me knowing I would reveal their true selves. They just didn't realize how literal that would be. Marcus reported her to the RCMP. Constable Patrick Dunn arrived from Williams Lake, interviewed subjects, examined paintings. Everyone confirmed they'd consented to the portrait. Nobody had been forced. And despite their emptiness, none of them regretted it. They said they felt lighter, unburdened, finally free from emotions that had weighed them down. Patrick couldn't arrest someone for painting portraits with consent. There was no crime, no violation of law. Katerina was free to continue her work. She completed 43 portraits by mid-November. 43 people in Red Bluff walked around feeling hollow, going through the motions of life without the emotional depth that made them human. They functioned, worked, interacted, but something fundamental was missing. They were people-shaped voids. Marcus organized the unsettled remainder of the town. About 30 people who'd refused to sit for Katerina. They decided to investigate her background. Where had she come from? How was she doing this? They found nothing. Katerina Holst had no history before Red Bluff. No records, no past addresses, no credit history. She'd appeared fully formed with a reputation that nobody could verify. Several people claimed to have seen her work in galleries, but nobody could remember which galleries or where. Marcus broke into her studio one night, needing to understand. He found the portraits stored in her back room, all 43 of them, arranged in rows. And they were moving. Not physically moving, the canvases were still, but the expressions on the painted faces were changing, shifting. responding to something. He realized the portraits were alive. Katerina hadn't just captured emotions on canvas. She'd captured entire interior lives, the hidden selves of her subjects, and those selves were conscious, aware, trapped in paint and linen. The painted versions of people were experiencing time. They were thinking, feeling, suffering. Marcus could see it in their eyes, see the awareness and horror of their situation. They were imprisoned in 2 dimensions, unable to move, unable to speak, only able to experience existence as frozen, painted things. He tried to communicate, to help them, but they couldn't respond beyond shifts in expression. Painted. Imogen's eyes followed him, pleading. Painted. Trevor's mouth seemed to scream silently. They were conscious minds trapped in inert matter, and they would be trapped as long as the paintings existed. Marcus confronted Katerina again. You have to release them. Destroy the paintings. Give them back their selves. I can't, she said simply. The extraction is permanent. If I destroy the paintings, those emotional selves die. The people lose those parts forever. Right now, at least the emotions continue to exist, even if trapped. Destruction would be true death for those aspects of their souls. Then merge them back. Reunite the painted selves with the living people. Also impossible. The separation can't be reversed. I'm not a thief, Marcus. I'm an artist. I reveal truth. I show people their hidden selves. That those selves become independent wasn't my intention, but it's a consequence I accept. Art demands sacrifice. Marcus realized Katerina wasn't human, not in any normal sense. She was something else wearing human form, something that fed on or collected human emotional depth. The portraits were her harvest. She would complete her work in Red Bluff and move on to another town, leaving behind a population of empty people and a collection of trapped souls. He gathered the unsettled 30 and proposed a plan. They would commission Katerina to paint something else, a self-portrait. If she captured her own true self, perhaps they could learn what she really was, how to stop her. Katerina agreed, amused by the proposal. She set up a mirror in her studio and began to paint herself. It took her 3 days, far longer than any previous portrait. When she finished, the painting showed something that made Marcus's sanity threaten to fracture. The portrait showed Katerina's true form, a being made of paint itself, a creature constructed from pigment and oil, existing to absorb and preserve human emotional complexity. She wasn't a person painting portraits. She was a predatory artistic force that had learned to mimic human form, traveling from place to place, extracting the aspects of humanity she found most interesting and preserving them in her collection. But the act of painting her self-portrait had the same effect on her as it had on her subjects. Her own essence was now trapped on canvas, separated from her physical form. Katerina in the flesh became hollow, empty, an animated shell lacking the core of whatever she truly was. She stood in her studio, staring at nothing, trapped in the same emotional void she'd imposed on others. The painted version of her true self looked out from the canvas with alien geometry, still conscious but now imprisoned in its own medium. Marcus and the others had a choice. They could destroy Katerina's self-portrait, ending her truly, along with the trapped aspect of her being. But that would mean accepting that destruction was an option. And if they could destroy her portrait, they could destroy the portraits of their neighbors, ending those trapped emotional selves forever. The debate split the group. Some argued for destruction. Better to end the suffering than let it continue indefinitely. Others insisted they had no right to kill the painted selves, that those aspects of their neighbors were still alive and deserved to remain so, even in their imprisoned state. The compromise was terrible but necessary. They would preserve all the paintings, including Katerina's self-portrait, storing them in a climate-controlled facility. The painted selves would continue to exist, trapped but alive. The living people would continue in their hollow states, functional but incomplete. And Katerina's physical shell, now empty of its true essence, would remain in Red Bluff as a reminder and a warning. A hollow artist presiding over a collection of captured souls. Red Bluff still exists, though it's changed. The hollowed people still live there, creating art mechanically, going through motions they no longer feel passion for. The paintings are stored in the old assay office, locked away, preserved carefully. Katerina's empty body still moves through the studio, cleaning brushes, organizing canvases, performing the rituals of art, without understanding or intention. Visitors sometimes come to Red Bluff, attracted by the town's reputation as an artist colony. They find the residents strange, distant, emotionally flat. Some visitors ask about commissioning portraits. The remaining whole people warn them away, explain what happened, but some don't listen. And sometimes, late at night, Marcus stands in the assay office looking at the stored portraits. He sees the painted people's eyes following him, pleading or accusing or simply aware. He wonders if consciousness without sensation is worse than death. He wonders if keeping them alive in their prisons is mercy or cruelty. And he knows that he'll never destroy them, never release them, because despite everything, they're still alive, still experiencing existence, and who is he to end that, even if it's suffering? He's made Red Bluff into a mausoleum for the still living, a town of ghosts who cast shadows, and he'll maintain it until he dies. This terrible gallery where art captured life too literally and preserved it in a form that should never exist. Story 10. The north-going people. There was no town. That's what made the last case so disturbing. It happened across all of northern Canada in the winter of 2012, in places with names and places without them, to people who lived in communities and people who lived alone. They all started walking north. Inspector Amanda Zhang of the RCMP was the first to recognize the pattern. She worked out of Yellowknife, covering an enormous territory, and in January 2012, she noticed missing person reports accumulating. People vanishing from isolated communities across the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and northern British Columbia. Always in winter, always heading north. The first case was Roland Christensen, a trapper working trap lines near Great Bear Lake. He left his cabin on January 5th, walking north into the wilderness without supplies, without gear, in -40-degree weather. His body should have been found within kilometers, dead from exposure. But searchers found his tracks continuing for 30 kilometers, arrow straight north, before they disappeared into rocky terrain. Then Margaret Ung vanished from Tuktoyaktuk. Then Joseph Okpik from Joa Haven. Then Casey Morissette from Fort Simpson. 15 people in 3 weeks, all walking north, all disappearing. None of them had any reason to leave. None of them had expressed dissatisfaction or mentioned plans to travel. They simply got up one morning, walked out into the Arctic winter, and kept going north until they vanished. Amanda flew to Fort Simpson to investigate Casey's disappearance. She interviewed his wife, Diane, who described Casey's behavior before he left. "He stood in the backyard for hours the night before," Diane said. "Just stood there in the snow looking north. I called him to come inside. He said he could hear them singing. I didn't hear anything, just the wind." Amanda checked Casey's computer. History. In the weeks before his disappearance, he'd researched northern geography obsessively. Maps of the Arctic Ocean, charts showing ice thickness, locations of the magnetic North Pole. He'd downloaded navigation software and spent hours plotting routes north from Fort Simpson, calculating distances, finding the most direct paths. She found similar patterns in the other cases. Every person who'd vanished had shown prior interest in northern geography. Everyone had mentioned hearing something, singing, calling, voices in the wind. Everyone had been found standing outside, facing north, in the days before they left. Amanda traveled to Great Bear Lake, following Roland Christensen's trail personally. She found his tracks exactly where the search team had described, leading north. She followed them for kilometers, noting their characteristics. Roland had been walking steadily, purposefully. His stride was even, unhurried. These weren't the tracks of someone confused or panicking. They were the tracks of someone walking toward a specific destination with complete confidence. At the end of the visible trail, where tracks disappeared into rocky ground, Amanda found something the initial search team had missed. Scratched into stone. They're waiting. They've always been waiting. The North calls and we must answer. 23 more people vanished in February, then 41 in March. The pattern expanded. Reports coming from Alaska, from northern Quebec, from Greenland and Siberia. This wasn't isolated to Canada anymore. It was circumpolar, affecting everyone living above 65 degrees north. Amanda coordinated with international agencies. Everyone was experiencing the same phenomenon. People hearing calls from the north, people walking into the Arctic wilderness, people vanishing. And nobody was finding bodies. With hundreds of people now missing, there should have been corpses, people who died from exposure before reaching whatever destination they sought. But searchers found nothing except tracks leading north and occasional messages scratched into stone or snow. We are going home. The North remembers us. They built it for us. We're the last piece. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, an anthropologist from the University of British Columbia, contacted Amanda with historical research. She'd found references to similar events in indigenous oral histories across the Arctic. Stories of people being called north appeared in Inuit, Gwich'in, Nenets, and Sami traditions. These stories were ancient, referenced events from centuries or millennia past, and they all described the same thing. Periodically, people would hear singing from the far north and would walk into the ice, never returning. The traditional stories said the walkers were being summoned by something that lived at the true north, beyond the reach of the sun, in the permanent ice. The stories didn't agree on what the something was. Some said ancient spirits, some said gods, some said beings from before humans existed. But all the stories agreed on one detail. The called ones were going to complete something, to finish a task that had been started long ago. Amanda received a call on March 26th from a radar station on Ellesmere Island. Their instruments had detected something impossible. A massive structure, completely hidden from satellite imagery, but visible on certain radar frequencies, located on the ice approximately 100 kilometers from the North Pole. The structure was enormous, perhaps 10 kilometers across. It appeared to be metallic, but showed no heat signature, no electromagnetic activity, nothing except its physical presence. And it was surrounded by people, thousands of them, visible as tiny dots on the radar, all converging on the structure from every direction. Amanda joined an expedition to the site. A joint task force of Canadian, American, and Russian personnel, scientists and military, traveling by helicopter and landing as close to the structure as they dared. What they found defied explanation. The structure was a machine, but not any kind of machine humanity had ever built. It was constructed from materials that looked like metal, crystal, and something organic, all fused together. It rose from the ice like a vast flower, components arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The entire thing was vibrating at a frequency just below human hearing, producing a sound that wasn't sound that they felt in their bones. and walking toward it from every direction were people. Hundreds in immediate view, thousands more visible in the distance. They walked in perfect straight lines, converging on the structure, unhurried and silent. Many should have been dead. They'd been walking for weeks without food or water, through Arctic conditions without proper gear. But they kept moving, animated by something beyond normal human endurance. Amanda tried to intercept them, to stop them, to ask what they were doing. But the walkers didn't respond. Their eyes were distant, focused on something she couldn't see. They walked around her if she stood in their path, adjusted their courses to maintain their northward trajectory, and kept going. She followed them to the structure. As walkers reached it, they placed their hands on the surface and became absorbed. Not quickly, not violently. They simply merged with the machine, their bodies converting into the same strange material the structure was made from, adding their mass and complexity to the whole. Dr. Tanaka examined the structure's surface. "It's incomplete," she said, voice shaking. "Look at the patterns. There are gaps, spaces where components should be. The people who are merging with it, they're filling those gaps. They're becoming parts of it, building it from the inside." The machine was using human bodies as components, converting flesh and bone into whatever material it needed. And the people were willing participants, walking to their transformation with complete acceptance. The machine had called them, and they had answered. Amanda watched hundreds of people merge with the structure over 6 hours. She recognized faces from missing person reports. Roland Christensen, Margaret Ung, Casey Morissette, and so many others. They showed no fear, no hesitation. They walked into the machine and became it, their individuality dissolving into the greater mechanism. The expedition tried to understand the structure's purpose. Was it a weapon? A communication device? An engine of some kind? None of their instruments could penetrate it. None of their analysis made sense. The machine operated on principles that weren't consistent with known physics. One of the Russian scientists, Dr. Pavel Sokolov, had a theory. "It's a beacon," he said. "Look at the structure. It's designed to generate some kind of signal, but not electromagnetic. Something that propagates through space differently. And it needs biological components to function. Specifically, it needs conscious minds integrated into its structure. That's why it's calling people. It needs human consciousness as part of its mechanism." "A beacon for what?" Amanda asked. Pavel pointed north, toward the pole, toward space beyond. "For whoever built it. This is millions of years old, I think. Older. It was placed here when this region was different, when the continents were arranged differently. Something built it and left it here, incomplete, with a mechanism to call for help, to summon the local intelligent life to finish it when they evolved. We're being harvested to complete an alien machine that will signal our own obsolescence." The expedition called for military intervention, considered destroying the structure. But how do you destroy something that size, that completely unknown? Nuclear weapons might work, but they might also activate it, might trigger whatever signal it was designed to send. While they debated, more people arrived. The flow of walkers had increased. Not hundreds now, thousands, streaming across the ice from every direction, a constant river of humanity walking into the machine and merging with it. The gaps in the structure were filling. The machine was approaching completion. Amanda made a decision. She walked toward the structure, intending to merge with it herself, to perhaps retain some consciousness inside it, to learn from within what it was doing, and report back somehow. She placed her hands on the surface, and felt it begin to accept her, felt her body starting to convert. And in that moment of connection, she understood. The machine wasn't malevolent. It had no awareness of humans as individuals, as sapient beings with rights and desires. To the machine, humans were simply available materials, biological resources that happened to have evolved in the same location where it had been placed. It was using them the way a plant uses soil, thoughtlessly, automatically, because that's what it was designed to do. The signal it would send would call its builders, beings from outside the galaxy, perhaps outside the universe, traveling through dimensions humans couldn't perceive. They would come to retrieve their beacon, and they would find Earth, and humanity would be irrelevant to them, not enslaved, not destroyed, simply irrelevant in the way. A consequence to be managed or ignored. Amanda pulled back, broke the connection before the conversion completed. She stumbled away from the structure, her hands already changing, cells reorganizing into crystalline structures. Dr. Tanaka grabbed her, pulled her further back, and the conversion stopped, reversed, partially. Amanda's hands returned to mostly flesh, though metallic veins now ran under her skin, permanent reminders of how close she'd come. The expedition evacuated. They couldn't stop the machine. All they could do was prepare for what came next. The structure completed itself on April 30th, 2012. 7,312 people merged with it, their bodies converted into components, their consciousness integrated into its mechanism. The machine activated, sending a signal into dimensions human instruments couldn't detect. The Arctic communities mourned their lost members. Memorials were held in hundreds of towns and villages. The world tried to understand and mostly failed, explaining the disappearances as a mass casualty event, environmental disaster, anything except the truth. Amanda Zhang still works for the RCMP, though she's been transferred to a special unit that monitors the polar regions for similar phenomena. The machine stands at the North Pole, inert now, its signal sent. Nothing has responded yet. Perhaps nothing will. Perhaps the builders are dead, their civilization extinct, their beacon calling into void. But Amanda has nightmares where she hears the singing again, that call from the north that she felt in the moment of connection. And she knows that the machine used only 7,000 people to complete itself. It was designed for a species with a different population density, different numbers. If the builders return and find their beacon constructed from such a small sample of local life, they might be disappointed. They might activate the beacon again, call for more people, more biological components to expand the structure, to make it grander, more suitable for their purposes. 7,000 was the minimum. The machine could absorb millions, billions. The entire human species could merge with it, converted into components, consciousness integrated into a signal beaming toward something older and stranger than life itself. And if it calls again, people will walk north. They won't be able to help themselves. The machine knows how to reach into human minds now, knows exactly what frequency to broadcast on. Next time, everyone will hear the singing. Next time, the entire species will become the message, walking north until the last human merges with the beacon and the signal grows strong enough to reach across the cosmic gulf and summon things that will make humanity's extinction a footnote in their incomprehensible agenda. Amanda keeps her transfer request ready, keeps her car gassed up, keeps supplies packed. When the singing starts again, she'll try to run south, away from the call, as far as she can get. She knows it won't work. The machine's pull is inexorable, but she'll try anyway, because the alternative is accepting that humanity's end will come from the north, from the ice, from a machine that doesn't care if we live or die, that only cares we're useful materials for constructing a monument to our own insignificance, one merged body at a time.